Hello Grumpies. So this is my reaction to episode 5 of the Rings of Boredom. It's the first episode we've had so far with all the different plot lines in it. So we've got Lady Boss Captain Marvel in Numenor. We've got the Fartfoots and Catweasel, who can speak now. We got Black Legolas and the Artful Dodger and the DEATHSWORD and the Orcs. And Laurel and Hardy are back, DURIN and Elrond. So there's this terrible scene at the start where Lady Boss Galadriel takes on like 5 blokes and shows them how to use a sword properly, because like, not only do women not need no man, women are better at being men than men, which is the usual sexist bullshit. Oh, it's bloody awful. Now the only plot line I was interested in, if you've been following these videos, was Laurel and Hardy, DURIN and Elrond, because that seemed to me to be the only plot line that had anything to do with the Rings of Power, because the show's called the Rings of Power, but we're 5 episodes in out of 8 and we ain't had fuck all that's remotely connected to the Rings of Power in the title. So I thought, oh, that's the only plot line that's actually got anything to do with it, that's the only one I'm interested in. Turns out I was wrong. That plot line ain't connected to the rings neither. So you'll remember back in episode 2 when Elrond went to the dwarves and the king of the dwarves lifted up the lid of the box and there was something in the box, but we didn't see what it was until episode 4. Turns out that the thing in the box is a bit of mithril. Now Elrond gets his bit of mithril from DURIN. They go back to Lorien to see the king of the elves, and he gives this bit of mithril to CELEBRIMBOR, and CELEBRIMBOR does some laboratory tests on it in some sort of elf laboratory or something, and it turns out that the elves want the mithril to heal their magic tree. It's got nothing to do with making rings. So there's this magic tree in Lorien that is dying or something, and the light of the Valar is fading, which means that the elves are eventually gonna die or something. So mithril is basically Tolkien's vibranium. If you remember the actual Rings of Power, 3 were given to the elves, 7 to the dwarf lords, 9 to the kings of men. So the 3 elven rings are Narya, Ninya and Vilya. Now they were made by CELEBRIMBOR, so we're nowhere near that happening yet, but he's going to do that at some point. So Narya represents fire, Ninya represents air, and Vilya represents water. So when the rings eventually get made, God knows when that's going to be, Gil-galad gets Narya, and he gives that eventually to a bloke called Círdan, and he gives it to Gandalf. Galadriel, Lady Boss, gets Ninya, and Elrond gets Vilya. Now we know from Tolkien that Vilya was made of, guess what, mithril, and probably the other elven rings were too. So this mithril stuff is eventually, as I say, God knows when, is eventually going to be used to make the elven rings of power. Now mithril, as you may remember, was what Bilbo's vest was made of, that he got from Thorin, that he gave to Frodo in Rivendell. So the dwarves are mining for this mithril stuff, and they go so deep into the earth that they waken up the Balrog. The Balrog what did for Gandalf, if you remember, "You shall not pass," and all that. And that Balrog is eventually going to kill DURIN, which is why it's known as DURIN's Bane. Now the elves are talking about the light of the Valar, right? Now this is where it gets a bit complicated. So in Tolkien's Catholic-based cosmology, right, Ilúvatar, which is God, creates the world, and the world is known as Arda, and Middle-earth is part of Arda. And there's the Valar, who are like archangels, and the Maiar, who are like angels, and the Valar and the Maiar together are known as the Ainur, right? Bit complicated, but bear with me. So they help Ilúvatar create the world through music and song, which is known as the Ainulindale. Melkor, who, if you remember, is also known as Morgoth. He was the bloke who snuffed out the 2 trees at the very start of the first episode. Melkor was a Valar, and Sauron was a Maiar. And some of the Maiar, known as Istari, were sent to Earth, and one of them is Gandalf. So there's Valar, what are archangels, there's Maiar, what are angels, and Sauron and Gandalf are both Maya. So Sauron comes to Numenor eventually, because Captain Marvel, Galadriel, Lady Boss, she's off to the Southlands to off some orcs with Halbrand, who's the bloke who picked her up on the raft when she jumped ship back in episode 1, and Elendil, who snuffed it in the Fellowship prologue. If you remember, he goes to have a go at Sauron, gets whacked, and it was in this moment when all hope had faded that Isildur, son of the king, took up his father's sword and all that. Well, the geezer whose sword he took up was Elendil. So Captain Marvel, Lady Boss, Halbrand, who may or may not be Sauron, and Elendil are off to the Southlands to off some orcs, and Isildur is with them, and his sister, Eärien, who's now going to be known as Titsildur. Unfortunately, she's hardly in it this episode, which is a shame. So they're off to the Southlands to off some orcs, and presumably as some part of that, capture Sauron, unless Halbrand is Sauron. And what they're going to do is eventually they're going to bring him back to Numenor, and he's going to fuck up the Numenorians, and Numenor, which is Tolkien's Atlantis, is going to be destroyed. And then after that, he's going to call himself ANNATAR, and he's going to convince Celebrimbor, remember him, to craft the rings, the elven rings of power, which are made of MITHRIL, which Durin and his chums are mining for in Khazad-dûm, and they're going to waken up the Balrog. None of which is going to happen. Well, we've only got 3 episodes left in this first series. We're on episode 5. There's supposedly 8. But 3 more episodes? Where are we going to get to in terms of that story? Probably we're only going to maybe meet Sauron at the end of episode 8. Either Halbrand's going to be revealed as Sauron, or they're going to find Sauron or something. This whole Numenor getting destroyed thing, that's going to be series 2, isn't it? Not only is this thing incredibly boring, not only does it have fuck all to do with the Rings of Power that's in the title, it's nowhere near progressing the story to the point where it actually does anything with the Rings of Power. There's one last thing I want to mention, which is this. The bloke who plays Durin, he's Welsh. He ain't Scottish, but he's playing Durin with a Scottish accent, because, as we know, all dwarves are Scottish. And the fat bird who plays Disa, she ain't Scottish neither. So how do the lefties square all this nonsense about authenticity with the fact that you've got 2 actors who ain't Scottish playing Scottish? Surely, if you believe in authenticity, then you should have 2 Scottish actors playing Scottish, not someone who's Welsh and someone who's English putting on cod Scottish accents. I wonder why Russell T Gaynor don't have nothing to say about that. He's all for authenticity, isn't he? Probably for the same reason nobody said anything about appropriation when Shittika wore Chinese clothes. It's not like the lefties to be hypocritical, is it? Rings of power? Rings of bollocks, more like.
Fuck off!